from the University of Tokyo to discuss the late Marx and Kohei's work on degrowth communism from his book, Slow Down, the Degrowth Manifesto. It's a privilege to have you here with us, Kōhei. The field of study surrounding the late Marx is a burgeoning area of research that is changing the way many of us read and interpret Marx. It represents perhaps the single most important development in the study of Marx since, well, perhaps since the mid-1960s with the Althusserian break, or even perhaps earlier, since the 1930s. There have been these formative moments in the reception of Marx when all our common understandings and shared interpretations have been challenged and revised. That surely happened in the early 1930s with the publication of the young Marx, of the early philosophical works of Marx. For instance, in 1932, with the complete publication in German of the Paris manuscripts, the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, or similarly the same year, in that period, right, 1932, when the entire Brussels manuscripts, what we call the German ideology, were published for the first time in German by the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow. The publication of those early philosophical manuscripts revolutionized the way people read Marx, pushing thinkers like Herbert Marcuse or Alexandre Kojève to focus on the Hegelian and philosophical underpinnings of Marx. And these brought about rereadings that broke the spell at the time of a more dogmatic Soviet reading of Marx and gave birth to a wave, a whole vogue of writings, particularly in post-war France. We can think of other periods that transformed our reading of Marx. The publication in 1953, for instance, in East Germany of the Grundrisse, the economic manuscripts of 1857 and 1858, which we discussed with Michael Hart and Sandro Mazzadra, that created another burst of new readings that then tied volume 1 of Capital back to social theory and social relations. And since the 1970s, but mostly in the last decade or so, there has emerged a whole new panel in the triptych, right, of the young, the mature, and now the late Marx. Late Marx being defined loosely as the final decade, 1873, 1883, or sometimes just the final years, 1881, 82, 83 of Marx's life, the period following the publication of Capital Volume 1 in 1867, the turmoil of the Paris Commune, and the close of the First International. It's a period defined by new materials and manuscripts. These include, of course, and already from back in 1972, the ethnological notebooks that were published in 1972, the annotations and notes he took while he was reading the works of Henry Louis Morgan, of John Budd Fears, the Aryan Village, Henry Sumner Main's lectures on the early history of institutions, John Lubbock's The Origin of Civilization. So that was already beginning in the early 1970s. Of course, the letter to Vera Zasulich and all of the drafts were already around for a long time. But many of the new publications of the manuscripts that were filled with passages where Marx was reading from natural scientists, from chemists, from agricultural chemistry, from German legal historians, etc., are of more recent vintage, right? And these newer materials have created a rich field of research, and there are many scholars toiling in these new fields. Kohei Saito has done foundational work in this area with his earlier book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, Capital, Nature, and the Unfinished Critique of Political Economy, published in 2017, and also Capital in the Anthropocene, published in 2020. Other scholars as well have been mining this field. Marcelo Musto, author in 2016 of The Last Years of Karl Marx. Earlier, Theodor Shannon and the other contributors to the late Marx and the Russian Road, Bruno Bostiels, who's here with us today, and his book on the Mexican Commune, Kolja Lidner and the scholars surrounding the publication of Le Dernier Marx, 2019. Others, Michael Lowy, Pier Paolo Poggio, Maximilian Rubel, etc. But what is unique about Kohei Saito is how he weds his reading of the late Marx to his concerns about climate change, about the destruction of nature, about the planetary ecological crisis. He updates Marx's vision of communism to address the problems of the Anthropocene and the sphere of nature. And of course, Kohei's work has itself evolved over time and is still evolving. I think we'll talk about that a little bit. But earlier, Kohei kind of used the late Marx to read and interpret Marx as embracing a form of steady state sustainable growth, possibly, or certainly what he called eco-socialism. In Slow Down, so beginning in the 2020s, Kohei began to reread the late Marx and push it further towards a Marx who actually embraced degrowth communism. And I think maybe also now you're rethinking that as well and kind of pushing Marx in other directions as well. But I think that, of course, for our purposes tonight, discussing Slow Down, that is the main argument, right? That Marx actually came to believe in degrowth communism himself at the end of his life. So it's a real privilege and honor to have Kohei with us today to discuss his reading of Marx and his advocacy of degrowth communism. Kohei is a professor of philosophy at the University of Tokyo. This year, 24-25, he's a fellow at the New Institute in Hamburg, and he's chair of the program Beyond Capitalism, War Economy, and Democratic Planning. Kohei received his PhD from Humboldt University in Berlin and has been contributing to the research project surrounding the new Mega 2 edition of the complete works of Marx and Engels. His book, which we're going to be discussing tonight, Slow Down, sold more than 500,000 copies in Japan, and it's generated a renewed interest in Marx's late writings in Japan and also, I would say, here in the US and Europe. And I'm particularly enamored by the book for its emphasis on cooperation. Your advocacy of degrowth communism includes at its heart an argument for worker cooperatives, consumer co-ops, and mutual aid, and it embraces the ambition of an economic regime of mutually reinforcing cooperative enterprise, which is where you both start your book and end the book, the English edition of the book, Slow Down, by calling for all companies, in your words, to, quote, become cooperatives or cease trading. So I think this dovetails well with the arguments for cooperation, understood as a network of cooperatives, mutuals, unions, and mutual aid. And it's particularly thrilling to have you here to discuss your work and possibly its relationship to cooperation. So let me turn it to you, Kohei, for your presentation, after which I'll make a few comments and we can have a discussion and open it up for a broader discussion. Welcome, Kohei Saito, to Columbia, and welcome all to Marx 11 of 13.
Hi, yes. Thank you so much, Bernard, for very generous introduction. And yeah, it was such an honor to be enter to Columbia University because now everyone was talking, oh, can you enter Columbia? And, you know, it's the degrowth communist can actually enter Columbia University. We can broadcast on YouTube and so on. Yeah. And anyway, so I'm gonna talk about this book, Slow Down, and about recent debate between me as a degrowth side and the people from the eco-socialist side, but they are who are more optimistic about technology, which can be categorized as eco-modernist people. And now there are a lot of misunderstanding about degrowth. And if you look at the social media, people say that, oh, Saitō is actually, or, you know, Trump is doing with tariffs, this degrowth policy, and Saitō must be happy and so on. So, you know, the localization and, you know, reducing the unnecessary consumption from China. And I mean, this has kind of like a degrowth images, but I'm trying to go back to Marx to actually present a more solid and consistent view of degrowth communism today. So let me begin. And, you know, I think it's very important to go back to Marx at this conjuncture because he's the one who actually problematized both inequality and environmental destruction as the main contradiction of capitalism. And today we all know that this kind of like inequality is actually growing, and also in the middle of pandemic, but also these, the carbon dioxide emission is also increasing, and these things are all related to infinite accumulation of capital, basically. So now, and we are last year overshooting the 1.5 degrees Celsius, and it's very likely that by the end of the century, we are now, we will overshoot 3.0 degrees Celsius or something. So it's gonna be really big chaos, and then inequality will grow, and so this is something that capitalism is really creating a big mess for the future generations. Planetary boundaries, and these are, just a general introduction, so not very important. Anyway, and so we are now entering into this kind of a chronic emergency, which Andres Malm adequately pointed out in the Anthropocene, because climate change is the kind of the irreversible change that whose influence is gonna last for centuries. Beginning with natural disasters, we will have more food and water insecurity, accelerating inflation, we will have more refugees, also increasing xenophobia, and then maybe there will be war and so on. So this is gonna be a real collapse of civilization in which the modern fundamental values like freedom, democracy, human rights can no longer be guaranteed for all. So, I mean, this is just, something that we all talk about. And then today we have many discussions about then how to deal with this kind of polycrisis situation. And then people from more liberal side basically talk about some kind of mission economy, ethical capitalism, Green New Deal, ESG, SDGs. And then they argue that with this kind of transformation, we will have more efficient, more just, more innovative, more sustainable economy, and with more growth even. And then they argue that this social democratic transformation of capitalism will reclaim itself. But is that the case? I don't think so. So it's not just me. I think especially I'm basically inspired by younger generation. Greta Thunberg, she's now kind of gone from the media, but anyway, I think she really influenced me thinking about the insufficiency of all those existing ways of mitigating climate change, and we need much deeper transformation. And I think that is why there's increasing interest. Like today, I'm very happy that in USA, people are interested in degrowth too. I was just in Texas, and then they didn't like my ideas, but maybe it's different in New York. And so there are more and more discussion about socialism and degrowth. That's my bright future thing. But anyway, so that's why we also have a lot of discussion of eco-socialism, even like war communism. And then my idea is basically degrowth communism. I'm trying to explain what it is about and why Marx still matters in the Anthropocene. So the reason why I came to endorse the idea of degrowth is that it is quite clear that the capitalism is creating many problems. As I said, expanding the economic inequality, but also at the same time degrading our planetary conditions. And the rich people are obviously also more responsible for this climate change. And that is why I think it is necessary to regulate and ban certain things like excessive consumption, like private jet, and then we will also have to ban big cars, and then reduce meat consumption, investing more in public transportation, and we also need to redistribute wealth and so on. So that's a very basic socialist ideas. But the problem is simply establishing that kind of equal society is not enough, because American workers get better jobs thanks to the Green New Deal, and then they might start buying second and third cars. They might fly to Mexico for vacation, and these are really not the kind of ecological transformation that we need to establish. So actually simply establishing kind of equal society might even reinforce the imperial mode of living and then destroying the planet even more. And this is why I think some people rightly argue that post-capitalism needs to be post-growth in today's situation. But the problem is there has been a deep divide between socialism and degrowth. For example, Matt Hoover, he's a more ecomodernist person. He says, criticizing degrowth as ecological austerity, that overall it would be quite sad to build a socialist movement capable of seizing the means of production only to prohibit from the outset the further development of the productive forces. Socialism is not stasis. What about fusion power, nuclear fusion, curing cancer? We still have so much left to accomplish as a species that capitalism might be holding us back. So he's saying that degrowth is simply kind of boring because once we take power, we have to build more, develop new technology to overcome poverty and other problems, including ecological crisis. Michael Levy also has this similar criticism. He says, many degrowthers seem to believe that the only alternative to productivism is to stop growth altogether or to replace it by negative growth, i.e. to drastically reduce the excessively high level of consumption of the population by cutting by half the expenditure of energy, by renouncing individual houses, central heating, washing machines, etc. Since these and similar measures of draconian austerity risk being quite unpopular, some of them play with the idea of ecological dictatorship. So degrowth is austerity, degrowth is unpopular, thus degrowth requires dictatorship. From the degrowth side, of course, there's a criticism against Marxist productivism. Serge Latouche is a famous one. He says, critique of capitalism was put forward by Marx, and yet the critique of capitalism is not enough. We need a critique of any growth society, and that is precisely what Marx fails to provide. Because it cannot integrate ecological constraints, the Marxist critique of modernity remains terribly ambiguous. The capitalist economy is criticized and denounced, but the growth of the forces it unleashes is described as productive, even though it is actually destructive. So he's saying that in socialism, Marxist naively believes that there will be more growth, and that is actually destructive for the environment. So he endorses the idea of degrowth. So there's a divide. On the degrowth, people criticize Marxism, and Marxists criticize degrowth. And this is something I try to overcome. In a different piece, Frederick Jameson reflects on this situation, and he says that one of the most durable opposition in the utopian projection was that between country and the city. So the country is the degrowth side, and the city is eco-modernist side. Perhaps its more contemporary form involves relation to technology and correspondingly diminishing nostalgia for nature. Or, on the other hand, passionate ecological commitment to prehistory Earth, this is the degrowth people, and even feebler pride in the Promethean triumph over non-human. So this is kind of old divide. It's continuing even today. So, we made no progress, basically. And Perry Anderson supports Jameson's judgment. He says that the crucial point is that the utopians or utopias are not about mapping out positive blueprint or creating a perfect schema. He says, for all their potential luxuriance of detail, writes Perry Anderson, utopia retains a stubborn negativity, an emblem of what, despite everything, we cannot grasp or imagine. So it's fine. I mean, we shouldn't describe this kind of like blueprint of the future society. And that's utopia. That's Perry Anderson. That's Jameson, basically. And I'm against this because without concrete vision, it's just not attractive, right? So that's what I'm trying to do is basically to try to overcome this opposition between countryside and the city, or degrowth and ecomodernism. Because as Raymond Williams says, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than disappear convincing. And in order to give hope, we need a positive blueprint vision of utopia. The problem is we have to first then overcome the Marxist kind of like a productivist view that we can no longer really accept in today's situation. And also this Eurocentric view is also very problematic. And this is I'm not going to read this because of time, very typical view that Marx expresses in Communist Manifesto, that basically he's kind of expressing his naive vision of productivism and Eurocentrism. And that's why Edward Said and those people always criticize and, they point out this kind of views in Young Marx, 1848. However, basically, this is not the only Marx. There's another Marx. Marx productivism cannot be overgeneralized because Marx became more and more ecological, especially in his late years. And that's what John Bellamy Foster clearly demonstrated in his book, Marx's Ecology, and the concept of metabolic rift plays a very important role. And the ecological Marxism or ecological socialism becomes the very productive sphere of research and also praxis. What is critique of metabolic rift? It's basically that, it's human and nature have to always interact and they exchange energy, resources, and also we generate a lot of impacts, no? Greenhouse gases, heavy metals, and so on. And this is a circular process. But the problem is basically in any society, we have been conducting this kind of metabolic interaction between human and nature because without nature or without working upon nature, humans cannot survive. And also animals are doing that same thing. But in capitalism, it has taken a very unique form because social production now totally oriented towards maximization of profit or for the sake of infinite capital accumulation. How do we achieve this? Basically, accelerating capital circulation and also expanding production, expanding sphere of money, commodity, and capital. So this is social metabolism, while the metabolism of nature, how the tree grows, how animal grows, and how fossil fuel is produced, and so on. This kind of natural metabolism remains more or less constant. The human cannot so arbitrarily change this natural metabolism. So on the one hand, this acceleration and expansion of social metabolism is really taking place, and it becomes faster and faster and bigger. Then we have to put more and more energy and resources in order to keep this system running. But at the same time, the metabolism of nature remains more or less stable, so inevitably creating basically rift between metabolism of society and metabolism of nature, leading to irreparable rift. This is the expression from Marx. In the interdependent process between social metabolism of commodity, money, and capital, and natural metabolism prescribed by law of nature, basically. So this is a key passage that Foster and I and other people often utilizes from volume 3 of Capital, where Marx refers to Justus von Liebig. And basically, Liebig is the guy who kind of provided the foundation of metabolic rift theory. But not just Liebig. Marx was not simply satisfied with Leibniz's theory, but he was also reading many new things, even after basically the publication of volume 1 of Capital. He was reading biology, of course, agriculture, chemistry, but geology, mineralogy, and the issues include not only soil exhaustion that the Leibniz was all basically talking about, but other issues such as excessive deforestation, leading to changes of local climate, but also premature slaughters of animals, and even extinction of species. So his research interest is actually quite wide, much wider than we used to think. And this is only, however, recorded or documented in his basically unpublished notebooks. Marx wasn't able to integrate his ideas into Capital, so these notebooks were never published. And then now they are being published under this Mega 2 project, Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, but it's only 7-8 years ago that became available. And I edited one of the volume, and based on that, I wrote my dissertation, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism. And this is Mega series, and the red one on the right side is the new Mega, and then the left side with the older one, only blue, is actually from the 20s and 30s, in which, for example, the Paris manuscript of German ideology were published for the first time. And of course, Stalin didn't like it, so he basically ended this project and killed Ryazanov and other great Marxist scholars. And then now that's why it's called the new Mega or Mega 2, because now this is a more complete version of this older project. And I'm doing this work, but at the same time, in this second book that I published in English, Marx in the Anthropocene, I try to overcome some issues that I actually wasn't really providing an answer in my first book, because basically the title of the first book is Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, and people try to read it or what Marx was actually imagining as eco-socialism, and in my book, I didn't really discuss it. But the problem is this title was given by Monthly Review Press, so it was not my idea, but it worked. But the problem is then people are like, hey, you lied. Where's Marx's eco-socialism? And that was the one problem. But it was also, I had to also answer that why Marx still matters. It's great for Marxists to know that actually Marx was ecological, but for non-Marxists, maybe so what, right? Okay, Marx was paying some attention, reading some outdated science like Libby. Who cares? It's 21st century. We have much more sophisticated theory like planetary boundaries or whatever, and then we also have new issues that Marx didn't know, like climate change. So we all have to just forget Marx and so on. So my approach now is basically, no, it's actually very important to read Marx in order to first understand today's ecological crisis, including climate change, but also in order to then envision a post-capitalist future in the 21st century, which is not austerity, which is not, eco-modernist and so on. And in order to do this, basically, I came back to this one problem that I didn't quite solve in my first book. Namely, this is Marx's crisis in the 1860s. Because Marx actually came to endorse the idea of an eco-socialist view. The socialism must be ecological, and capitalism actually destroy human nature, metabolic interaction, and so on. That actually created a very huge problem for Marx's view of history. Why? Because Marx used to believe that, especially in the 40s and 50s, productive forces is basically the main drive of historical development. There is a capitalist mode of production consisting of relations of production and forces of production. And then basically Marx says that after a certain point of development of productive forces, there will be a contradiction between relations of production and the forces of production. Then there will be a revolution. Then the mode of production also changes from slave society to feudalism, feudalism to capitalism, and then capitalism to socialism, of course. For this understanding, it's very simplified now, but then for this understanding, of course, then it is very important to maximize the development of productive forces, right? So that's one thing. It's a productivist. It's problematic. But also the other problematic part is Eurocentric. Why? Because basically he's saying that European societies are on a higher stage of society or history because they have higher development of productive forces. So compared to Indian society, whose productive forces basically remains the same for centuries, they need colonialism in order to kind of accelerate the social transformation. And that's what he basically says in the 50s, right? And so that's very much problematic. It's not only productivist, but also Eurocentric. But if you recognize that actually this development of productive forces in capitalism is not really development of productive forces, because it's rather exploitation of natural resources, and it's disrupting human metabolic interaction with nature. It's not really progress, right? It is rather destruction. And then that means that maybe the Western societies are simply possessing higher form of destruction, not a higher form of production anymore. Then maybe the Western societies are no longer really on the higher stage of history. Then his entire scheme of historical materialism basically collapses. So once you start questioning the kind of innovative or progressive character of the development of productive forces in capitalism because of ecological destruction, this entire theory, entire framework of history must go through a radical transformation. And this is what Marx had to go through after 1867, in the last 15 years of his life. This is the late Marx. And it is exactly how he overcome his productivist and also Eurocentric view of history. So I basically briefly summarize what he actually did. So in the 70s and 80s, he intensively studied pre-capitalist and non-Western societies like old German Teutonic communes, India, Russia, Indonesia, and also in the US, the Iroquois Federation. So he studied really many different kinds of things. And then he didn't really publish much, so we have to look at his notebooks and the letters and so on. And in the very last letter, in Russian revolutionary Vera Zasulich asks, Marx all of a sudden that, oh, actually, Marx, you are maybe Eurocentric because you are saying that the Russian society must first be invaded by capitalist power and then first destroy basically all the Russian communes. But Vera Zasulich asked, maybe we can use these Russian existing communes as a basis of revolution, establishing socialism, because there still existed communal production and communal ownership. So this is basically what socialism or communism was supposed to re-establish. So is it necessary to overcome this kind of pre-capitalist forms of production and ownership first by going through the Western form of modernization? Or can Russian society actually go through a different path to socialism? And, it's actually, this is exactly what Marx was actually studying, even though Vera Zasulich didn't know about it. So he actually prepared even 3 manuscripts for answering Vera Zasulich's question. And in those letters, he says, basically, the historical inevitability of the law of capitalist development in capital is limited to the countries of Western Europe. So Russia, no. I mean, you guys have different history, different analysis. Its capital is about Western Europe. And he even says, if the Russian Revolution becomes the sign for the proletarian revolution in the West, so actually Russians can actually begin the revolution first. And then the two, West and Russia, complement each other. Then Russia's peasant communal land ownership may serve as the point of departure for communist development. So it used to, in the 50s, he thought that the Indian society must be destroyed because they cannot make history. Here, he says the Russian can actually make new history towards socialism. So in that sense, his view clearly changed. And in some sense, he abandoned this Eurocentric view of history. However, I mean, some people like Kevin Anderson and Collier Lintner talk very highly of this non-Eurocentric view of history by late Marx. But the people like Stedman Jones is actually negative of this kind of reading. Why? Because basically Stedman Jones said, oh, Marx became old, and then Paris Commune failed. And in the 70s, the Western European society became reactionary and conservative. So Marx basically fetishized the other in the Russian society. And the Russians were very eager to translate Marx's Capital. And so, he got all kind of get the wrong view and the wrong expectation on Russian society. And he was also reading something like Morgan and all those outdated anthropology. Basically, Stedman Jones even says it's a kind of like a 19th century phantasm, and Marx fell into some kind of nostalgic romanticism. So in this sense, according to Stedman Jones, basically Marx's view of history and his treatment of non-Western society must be limited to 19th century. It has no relevance for today's decolonial struggle or anything. So basically, it's a very academic, actually, but political reading of Marx by confining Marx to the 19th century. So that's why we can read Marx in the universities, but it's no political, it's not dangerous. It just, that's how Stedman Jones does this. Anyway, so I was not quite happy with this kind of reading. Of course, with Stedman Jones, no, but even Kevin Anderson. The problem is they only deal with one aspect. Marx was studying both natural sciences and non-Western societies. So two different things. But Kevin Anderson, Stedman Jones only pay attention to one single aspect. And then they don't deal with natural sciences, right? And so, they must be related. And because historical materialism, as I explained, he had to read natural sciences and then non-Western society because his view of history was in crisis. So Marx came to see the plant of a natural environment as the manifestation of a central contradiction of capitalism, and then consciously reflected on the irrationality of the development of productive forces of capital. And Marx studied radically different ways of organizing social metabolic interaction in pre-capitalist non-Western societies. And these two things are actually related to each other. And actually, if you read from this perspective, Marx had certain passages in the letter where he actually tried to connect these two aspects. He says, today, capitalism faces a social system which both in Western Europe and the United States is in conflict with science, with the popular masses, and with the very productive forces that generates. In short, capitalism is in crisis. The old reading will be here, productive forces, meaning that we have to maximize productive forces more, and then the crisis will be bigger. So this is a kind of like a Marxist-Leninist reading. But it's not convincing because Marx was already ecological in the end of the 1860s, so he wouldn't naively endorse that kind of maximization of productive forces anymore in 80s. So how do we read then this expression conflict with science? I actually follow Levy here because those natural scientists, including Levy, was criticizing capitalism because basically capitalist agriculture is simply about robbery and it's not about sustainability. It's about profit. undermining the basic condition of civilization. And so natural science can be radical, right? Today, also planetary boundaries and so on. We can use as a political kind of critique of irrationality of capitalist production. So that's what also Levy and other people like Flass was doing at that time. And then, how will the crisis end? Marx continues, he says, the crisis of capitalism will end through its own elimination, through the return of the modern societies to a higher form of an archaic type of collective ownership and production. Here, he's clearly referring to Russian society, but also the earlier kind of like German Teutonic communities, communes, where the ownership was basically communal, but also production was communal too. He's not saying that we should go back to that kind of primitive way of living. He's saying that we have to establish a higher form based on the higher productive forces and technologies, of course. But interestingly, anyway, he doesn't say here that communism would be established by pushing the capitalist development as much as possible. Rather, it's about returning to archaic type. West needs to return to a pre-capitalist society for the sake of establishing communism. What they need to do is, what kind of return? We have to ask, what kind of return do we imagine here? And interestingly, so basically, if you look at those, say, the Iroquois Federation and so on, Marx actually came to recognize that these societies are not only egalitarian, because people basically share many things, but also they are quite sustainable, living for thousands of years without destroying the natural conditions. Of course, in many societies, they also destroyed, but there are also successful examples. Why? One reason is basically those communes remain stable, steady state. They were not driven by the logic of capital accumulation. So that's how the society becomes equal and sustainable based on the steady state economy. Meaning that actually, he actually even finds the economic superiority. It's dramatic change. Marx used to think that the historical invariability of the Indian communes must be destroyed. Now he thinks it is the economic superiority because it's more sustainable, it's more equal, realizing kind of the different kind of freedom. It's not like today's capitalist freedom, but it's not like very old kind of, primitive freedom. It's like a new kind of freedom that we can actually imagine out of this kind of returning to higher form. So here, two seemingly irrelevant research in the field of natural science and pre-capitalist society prove relating to each other. Right? They are interconnected. Marx was clearly interested in different ways of organizing metabolism, and he was interested in sustainability, equality, and then he became basically a degrowth communist because his vision is not about maximization of productive forces. It's not about West imposes the future society, rather learning from non-Western societies. It's more decolonial, it's more egalitarian, it's more ecological, and that's my idea of degrowth communism, which is also quite relevant today. So that this revival of communism in living as a degrowth communism is very different from the productivist approach or reading of traditional Marxism, of course. And this distinction is basically eco-socialism is a wider category. And then some eco-socialism, like ecomodernism, advocate for more growth in socialism, like sustainable growth. But degrowth communism argue that the growth after a certain point is not sustainable, and nor it's not desirable, even in socialism. So it's a kind of narrower category of eco-socialism. But it's not austerity. No? One more passage, the key passages that I like from the Critique of the Gotha program. Marx says that in a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, And also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished. After labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with all-round development of the individual, and all the springs of commonwealth, Genossenschaftlicher Reichtum, flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of the bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. This famous passage. Here he also talks about kind of like productive forces will increase, and then there will be, the wealth become much more abundant. We can read this passage in a very productivist way. But this is also not convincing because it is also 1875. No longer he is that productivist, naive. He is more ecological, and he's deeply studying these non-Western societies. So I don't think he repeats that kind of Promethean view of the future society. So how do we read this? Basically, here he's using this Genossenschaftlicher Reichtum. It's a commonwealth. It's a Genossenschaft is the cooperatives, but also Marktgenossenschaft is like a Teutonic communes. There's a Genossenschaft meaning that we share many things. It's a member-based cooperatives and so on. And so that wealth is not individual private property. This is what we today call commons. This commons becomes abundant. And that's why we can actually overcome the narrow horizon of bourgeois rights. If we just talk about the abundance of private wealth, private property, private jet for everyone, something like that. I mean, that's what ecomodernists argue for. But it's still trapped in the narrow horizon of the bourgeois right, meaning that we establish commons, we commodify things, and that's how we create like some kind of public luxury or communal luxury that we actually enjoy. Right? So that's how actually he thinks that we actually overcome austerity too. It's capitalism that creates artificial scarcity and impose austerity on our life. So traditional socialism is problematic because it's pro-growth, and they don't care about like green technology. They don't care about ecological questions. And today, people like Matt Hoover, they are pro-growth, but they are interested in also ecological crisis, so they advocate for more development of green technologies in socialism. And they criticize that the degrowth is negating not only growth, but also those green technologies. That's why we have to go back to nature. It's kind of like a primitive Stone Age communism. But my idea of degrowth communism is anti-growth, but it's not anti-technology. Of course, we have to use renewable energies, electric vehicles, and we have to develop new technologies, maybe carbon capture and storage too, but these are the things that not automatically solve the climate change, right? Even if we have electric vehicles, we keep producing this gigantic Tesla truck, it really doesn't solve climate change, rather intensifies kind of ecological imperialism, more extraction of resources from the global south and so on. So technology also requires degrowth so that its capacity can fully kind of reduces our ecological footprint. Anyway, so this is my final slide. Ecomodernism is problematic for 3 reasons. One is it is continuation of Western imperial project. As I said, it can extract more wealth from the global south. It imposes a very Western view of development, and it's Eurocentric, right? On the other hand, degrowth is a project of decolonization. And this is what Marx was also trying to do. He was more eco-modernist, and then he became degrowth communist. And then he became more interested in problems in indigenous people, Indian society, Russian society, and so on. Second, eco-modernism is tied to productivism, growthism, and extractivism. It's clear? So degrowth offers rather an eco-feminist subsistence perspective that focuses more on care, mutual aid, and maybe some non-Western spirituality. Marx doesn't go so far, but maybe these are the things that we might be able to discuss. And third, eco-modernist technology does not realize automatically post-scarcity economy, because as long as our society is oriented toward infinite accumulation, even if no matter how much you have, it's not enough. You still need more. But the scarcity is actually then not a natural category. It can be a social category. Capitalism creates scarcity by commodifying things, and monopolizing things, and many problems that they create. Scarcity is also created by social relationship. So, meaning that if we change social relationship without maximizing technologies, without maximizing productive forces, it is actually possible to achieve post-scarcity economy based on public luxury and private sufficiency. And this kind of view is something that Marx was trying to develop in his late years. Of course, but he wasn't able to fully develop. But these are the topics that are still of great importance for us, obviously. And I think that is why that we shouldn't simply abandon Marx, but simply we shouldn't, say that Marx was correct about everything. He was, of course, many limitations, meaning that we have to go beyond Marx, but with Marx. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kohei. That was a marvelous presentation of your work and a wonderful basis to start a conversation. So give me 1 second here to. Okay. So what I was hoping to do was to start perhaps with 3 questions and then explore the relationship to cooperation. But first, starting with 3 questions having to do in part with the readings of Marx. And so maybe we'll go one question at a time. Otherwise, it might be a lot. So the first has to do with a sense I have at times in reading your work that you're pushing the late Marx a little bit further than where I would read the late Marx. So, and here I'm not entirely convinced that Marx really came to embrace communes and communal ownership in the West. Okay, now as distinct from in, say, the context of Russia. So I think one of the kind of most important passages that you cite is from a draft of the letter to Vera Sasulich, where you talk about the return of modern societies to the archaic type of communal property, which you shared with us. And your interpretation of that is that this means that kind of the communal property of the Germanic people, say, and the Mirs in Russia, and you write, holds within them elements to which the modern societies in Western Europe must return. Now, I have no doubt that Marx was going in that direction in the context of Russia, okay? But it's just less clear to me that he was in some way severing the analysis in Capital and going in the direction of communes in the West. And I mean, to a certain extent, he doesn't include that. I mean, he doesn't include that in the letter that he sends to Sasulich, right? I mean, so there's I mean, he's working through it. He's writing drafts. He's trying to figure out what he wants to say. But when he ultimately has to say it, he doesn't include that in there. So he doesn't go that far. He's not willing to, in some sense, publicly go that far. And so the question is whether it really does involve a return on the conception of Western Europe. And one question, so the first question really is about whether you're pushing it too far, but here would be the question, how much turns on that, right? So in other words, if I don't follow you all the way, right, to the final conclusion that this was actually necessary for Western Europe as well, how much actually turns on that? How much can we go on the same path, and how much turns on it for your argument for degrowth communism? Okay, so let's start there.
Okay. So, but, Marx clearly says that the capitalism in the West, European societies and the USA is in crisis, and this crisis of capitalism will be only solved by returning to archaic. So, I mean, he's clearly talking about Western society returning to the higher form of archaic type. And meaning that Marx was really clearly trying to apply his analysis to Western societies. It's also very problematic if Marx talks about, oh yeah, Russians can do their own thing, but we would in the West don't care. In today's context, it's very problematic, right? We try to grow more, but you guys must find a new way to establish socialism. Rather, what I want to say with my degrowth communism idea is basically, as Marx tried to do, by incorporating the economic superiority of non-Western societies into the Western society or the Western vision of post-capitalism, we should also try to establish more dialogue with the global South and so on. So this part is really important for my vision of post-capitalism. And the reason why also Marx didn't include this sentence into his actual letter sent to Vera Zasulich is the actual reply is very short. He prepared 3 manuscript draft letter, and then the actual letter is very simple one. One of the reasons is political. Zasulich was actually the one who wanted to hear that Marx is advocating for industrialization in Russia as well. And then that was but Marx at the time was closer to the group that actually tried to defend agricultural communes as the basis of revolution. And he even translated Chernyshevsky, what is to be done, and so on. So he's really into that kind of movement. And meaning that when Marx replies too long and very carefully, that actually creates some tension in Russia, right? Marx actually tried to be closer to the enemy group. And so that's why I think he was more trying to be concise, not being rude, but also not really elaborating and so
on. So you're holding on to it. If one didn't agree, how does that affect the theory of degrowth communism? How would it affect the theory of degrowth communism? In other words, does that mean does degrowth communism in the West depend on that? Or yeah, I mean, all right. So yes, another way to phrase this, right, is whether one can sever in a way this reading of late Marx from the argument for degrowth communism. In other words, could we make the argument without Marx? So there's climate cataclysm, yes. Only degrowth will solve that. I take it you don't necessarily need Marx for that. Capitalism is part of the problem. I take it you still retain a critique of capitalism, although the problem with the critique of capitalism is how much of Capital Volume 1 is left. And then we need to go beyond capitalism to a form of communism that is associated with the degrowth the degrowth comes from the climate context. So if one has some hesitations buying the full argument about the late Marx, can you sever it nonetheless, retain degrowth capitalism, and base it on the other parts of the argument in your book?
So some degrowth friend were angry because I was taking their ideas in order to defend Marx. And Marx was actually thinking the same thing that you do. And so, it's a kind of like I'm just trying to provide more politically correct view of Marx by imposing our current interest in decolonization, climate change, and so on and so on. Which is kind of true, of course. I mean, what's the point of reading Marx today, right? And of course, it's not about writing a journal article, but it's about really understanding today's crisis and how we envision the future. So for me, I think the act of reading Marx is a political one. And in that sense, it's for me very important to defend this vision of degrowth communism, even though I, in that sense, admit that without Marx, one could come to the same conclusion. I have many degrowth friends who are clearly anti-capitalist, and they don't necessarily use Marxian categories. I mean, they do, but then they don't really read notebooks or manuscripts, and of course, they don't have to do that in order to come to the same conclusion, basically. But I think that this book was actually, so originally I wrote this book for my fellow Marxist friends. They are still very hesitant to accept degrowth, like Michel Levy or Matt Huber. They really think that degrowth is unattractive, degrowth is austerity, degrowth is, doomed to fail, and so on, and incompatible with Marxist ideas. But by presenting this interpretation that I basically developed in Slow Down and Marx in the Anthropocene, I thought that we might be able to build the better dialogue from a socialist side. And this is also useful for degrowth people, I believe, because some degrowthers, as you pointed out, kind of go to the direction of steady state economy, that with simple regulation of the market and then more tax and maybe some prohibition, we can have market economy, but with more degrowth orientation. I don't think so. We have to go further than that. We have to challenge private property, privatization of production, and so on. These are the things that I think Marxist tradition can contribute a lot about democratic planning and so on. But yeah, the final point would be, I think degrowth, and I think degrowth should also endorse Marxist ideas, because Marx is also only a few philosopher or political economist who systematically analyzed capitalism in order to envision post-capitalism. For example, David Graeber, he's great, but even if you read his book, he doesn't really have any consistent theory of post-capitalism, right? Like Bullshit Jobs, it's fun to read, but you don't really get the new vision. It's a little bit different when you read Marx. So in that sense, I think we, socialist side and Marxist side and even anarchist side, can all learn from each other.
Okay. Let me ask you one question that's more for the theory, for the readers of Marx. It's more of a theoretical question here related to the reading of Marx, rather than its relationship to degrowth communism. So if one follows you down this reading of the late Marx, what is left of the other panels on the triptych? What is left of the early Marx? What is left of the mature economic Marx of, say, Capital. So clearly, you've presented and discussed the idea that the theory of the one piece of the theory of history is out the window, right? The idea that the productivism of capitalism is necessary to achieve communism, and that there's a historical path that goes through increased productivism. That clearly goes out the window. So to a certain extent, all or a significant piece of his philosophy of history is in question from the, let's say, from somewhere around 1844 to somewhere around 1859 or something like that, or 67. Okay. What about what other elements are out the window, and what do we retain really from, say, Capital Volume 1? I take it that the critique of capitalism is, I mean, one way to think about it is that the critique of capitalism is simply augmented, so that Volume 1 is not only about the exploitation of labor and the questions of surplus value and exploitation, but it's also a critique that is based on exploitation of the soil and nature. Does that mean that we're getting rid of other pieces of capital, or what can we retain there? There were these critiques of the cooperative form that Marx had, particularly, well, I think it's as late as the Critique of the Gotha Program, if I'm not mistaken, where he talks about the fact that cooperatives are born of the womb of capitalism, and so has the same problems, right? That I think we would need to sever or throw out the window in a way with a proper reading of the late Marx. So yeah, so the question becomes, what is left? What do we need to retain in the, say, mature Marx, and how much of that edifice, is worth retaining and developing?
Yes, so in the introduction, you mentioned that the Arthurian epistemological break. And I think I might have mentioned that kind of break in my Marx in the Anthropocene book too. But actually, that's kind of misleading. I'm actually not going that far. I mean, what I wanted to say is, for me, actually, this is a talk that I'm giving tomorrow and the day after tomorrow about ecological freedom. And I'm revisiting his early vision of freedom from actually the late Marxist, the Degrowth Communist perspective. I thought it was necessary because, yes, because of this epistemological break after 1867 creates kind of misunderstanding. Because, for example, for me, 3 volumes of Capital remains the central part of Marx's critique of political economy. So we don't have to abandon his labor theory of value. We don't have to abandon his critique of reification, alienation. So in that sense, I'm just following the development from 1844 Paris manuscript up until 3 volumes of Capital, the falling rate of profit. And I'm also working on rentier capitalism with Marxian category of rent is also important to understand today's digital capitalism and so on. So for me, ecologizing Marx or even making Marx degrowther doesn't really create any break in terms of basic categories that Marx utilizes in order to understand today's capitalist model production. But if you want to envision the future society, it must change significantly compared to especially Communist Manifesto or he's maybe even under the Grundrisse there, he was much more optimistic about the possibility of free time. You know, the free time is often about maximization of automation and expansion of realm of freedom, minimizing realm of necessity, and that kind of thing can be quite productive, right? So we have to correct, especially that's what my understanding is. Basically, a degrowth communism part is more related to the post-capitalism part. So in terms of his critique of capitalism, I don't have to abandon anything, and I can basically kind of build a consistent view from 1843 up until 1883.
With the exception of history.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And also with the exception, I take it, I mean, there is this in your book, there is a critique of Engels's reconstruction of volumes 2 and 3, right? After, yes.
So as long as Marx lives, he is consistent. He's unfinished. He changes a lot. But especially for the critique of political economy, he is consistent. So I'm more conservative than, say, Jason Moore. He tried to update labor theory value, right? So in that sense, my understanding of metabolic rift is quite conservative based on the basic understanding of labor theory value. But many things changed after he died. He didn't complete volume 2 and 3. He didn't, of course, publish notebooks. So people like Engels, even Engels didn't quite understand the scope and the project that Marx was trying to develop in his last years. And then there was also political situation, Russian Revolution, everything that made it really hard to read Marx in the way that we could try to do today. So it is a great opportunity. In the 21st century, we don't have to care about, Stalin or, so it's a very good time, actually.
So would you envision then a different edition of volumes 2 and 3?
Yes. So Mega publishes basically in the second section, the Abteilung 2, the section 2 publishes all the manuscripts of volume 2 and 3 in the original form, meaning that without editing or cutting, because Marx actually left 8 different manuscripts for volume 2. I mean, it's fragmentary, so it's not like the same length. Marx basically Engels basically combined, edited these 8 manuscripts with different stages of theoretical development into single volume. That's very problematic, obviously. Huh? And also the volume 3, the main part was written at 1864 and 5, meaning that even before the publication of volume 1. And then many parts actually remained premature. That's why he had to study after the publication of volume 1. But the problem is those parts that became premature is really hard to read because Marx was struggling as he wrote. Marx couldn't really elaborate his ideas, meaning that Engels had to cut it out, edit, he adds sentences to make it look like it's a complete work. So that really creates some problems. It's a very subtle edition, but then creates misunderstanding. So it's really important for me, at least, to read Marx's economic manuscript in the original form. Editing it, translating it into English or in Japanese, it's kind of hard because it's manuscript. It's not necessarily beautifully written, but it's a project that's, I think, worth doing.
Okay, so then let me take you to what I care about the most, which is the relationship to cooperatives here. So you have in the book, you have very well articulated proposals, 5 proposals. And so in part, the path to degrowth communism, I think, would go through some of these proposals, right? The 5 proposals, a shift from high value to high use value goods, reducing work hours, abolishing the division of labor, democratizing production, prioritizing labor-intensive work, so care work. Now, it's possible that you can think of cooperatives through the lens of the democratizing production piece of those. But it's also possible that you could think of the thrust of the book and the thrust of Degrowth Communism as taking a path through cooperatives and mutuals, actually. So, alongside maybe those 5 proposals that you articulate, there's also another way in which I think one could envisage, and I think you do in passages, that the way to degrowth communism is through cooperation, through forms of worker and consumer cooperatives, mutual aids, mutual everything, mutual insurance, etc., mutual aid, and democratization in every aspect of our lives. So you're right, worker co-ops play a crucial role in workers regaining their autonomy and power of self-determination. Every member of a co-op invests in, owns, and operates the enterprise. It's the owners who have the agency to discuss, determine what sort of work will be done, how will it take place, etc. And of course, you discuss the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers back in 1844, all the way to the Mondragon cooperatives today, and Barcelona, etc. So I think it's clear that these forms of cooperation would pave the way to degrowth communism along your vision here. And so I wanted to get your sense whether this is an imposition on the book or wishful thinking, or what is the role then, or how important are the cooperatives to the entire enterprise of degrowth communism?
Yeah, my tradition, I often use the term association. Marx also uses this term, association, instead of communism or socialism. He says not the communist mode of production. He often says associated mode of production, the production by associated workers and so on. So the association is basically a very important term because this term has been marginalized under state socialism in the 20th century. And so cooperatives, cooperation, these terms, association, are quite central. Of course, for early socialists in France and so on, but then they have been sort of wiped away in the history of Soviet socialism. So it's very important to go back to this tradition today, especially because state socialism failed, but also it's very hard to imagine that kind of like Russian revolution type of revolution, right? So in that sense, this kind of more bottom-up version of creating the space of commons, space of cooperatives, space of association, maybe some radical commons, is the way that we try to create the space outside capitalism, within capitalism. So it's an everyday communism that we actually still, in this kind of like a globalized capitalism, can attempt to create as the basis of further struggle. And then the campus should be that kind of places. And this is why I think it's very important to have the student campus protest and so on. But at the same time, this is more related to the current project and the issue of overshooting the 1.5 degrees Celsius and so on. Associations alone can't really fight against this global system. If this ecological situation becomes really, really bad, it's hard to imagine that they will somehow stop all the rise of fascism and so in that sense it creates some tension. We really have to think what kind of cooperatives that we can still build in the middle of this kind of a rapid degradation of material condition of civilization. Maybe they become more important because this existing system of the market and the globalization collapses, and then we just have to take care of ourselves even more. And we cannot simply depend on commodities, cheap products from global south anymore. In that sense, cooperatives and the way how we try to regain more skills and mutual aid and that kind of community-based production on a local level becomes even more important. So that might accelerate degrowth communism. That might also create the material conditions for popular support for that kind of engagement and practices. Or maybe it's the opposite, right? Or forget about that kind of thing. We just have to conquer whatever resources that we can achieve. And, so it's contingent. It's political struggle, and that situation today is still quite unclear. So in that sense, I still totally stick to this kind of idea, and I think it was very good to have we have this common view of socialist tradition and then its possibility and its practical importance. But at the same time, we also have to pay attention to this bigger planetary crisis that I guess we didn't enough talk about.
So that's the sense in which your thought is evolving right now, right? Right. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I think we should open it up to conversation. This is supposed to be a seminar setting, but because there was a lot of interest in Kōhei being here on campus, we turn it into a bit more of a kind of a lecture setting. But we're going to try and maintain the seminar setting. So anyone who wants to jump in, start jumping in. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let me pass the mic and let me and just to put one footnote, I think we do need to continue this conversation in terms of trying to think about the relationship between forms of cooperation, forms of cooperatives or cooperism, and the relationship between that and the common. Because, I mean, in the way you were talking right now, the two are in some way elided, but I think it's possible that we need to separate them, think of them slightly differently, maybe think of cooperism as a stage towards the common or something, rather than being exactly the same thing, since the cooperative enterprise is more is a smaller enterprise than the common as a governed space, a democratically governed space. Okay, but anyway, we can continue to have that conversation and we can bring in more voices. So let me pass the mic, and I'll be moving the mic back and forth, and introduce yourself to us.
Hi, I'm in Latin American Studies, the CLS, and thank you for interesting. I wanted to ask what are your thoughts on the notion of the capitalist scene? Just because I know there is a critique of the Anthropocene as a concept that is embedded in a sort of bourgeois universal, bourgeois abstract universalism, and how it obscures not only capital social relations, but also indigenous communities and societies and cosmologies in time and space, which live in harmony or more harmony with nature. So I was just wondering, what do you think about that discussion?
Great, thanks so much. We'll take right here.
Hello, my name is Chris. Thank you so much for the talk. It was wonderful. I guess I have two very short questions. One is that when reading your work, I often think of other so-called like heterodox Marxist thinkers who maybe predate something like a degrowth movement, and often comes to mind Theodor Adorno, who said that with the productive forces and so on and so forth currently in existence, we could have this abundance or this post-scarce society just through some different mode of organization. But he notoriously was very skeptical of positivistic science or this urge of domination of resources. So how do you see us relating to science in a better way today? Like you said, that actually is able to expose maybe this illogical character. And then my second short question is, do you think that framing degrowth as a return to certain movements or drawing upon fetishized maybe notions of spirituality could lead to some problems rather than framing it as a sort of a sublation or some other move there? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. Let me add one more question, and then we'll come back to you, Kohei, and then we'll come back to the other questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. This is great. My name is Ansong. I'm a PhD student in anthropology. And I wanted to ask a question about Marx's reading of anthropology, unsurprisingly. I was really struck by how many different, 19th century ethnologists he was reading. And I'm curious about how he kind of thought about the archaic type and, the differences in the kinds of archaic societies he was describing. Obviously, I think a lot of his work in the Mega is kind of just transcribing long passages. So I don't know if you can kind of speak to how he thought about these differences, but I guess I'm curious about thinking about, the fact that a lot of these archaic societies weren't necessarily not hierarchical. They also had kind of internal divisions. And, if you were to ask somebody who's living in one of these archaic societies about their practices of commoning and communal production, they'd probably be much less interested than in talking about the things that differentiated them, the prestige goods, the things that differentiated people with higher status and lower status. And it seems to me that there's a tension there between thinking about archaic societies as kind of, wellsprings of like this kind of communal way of organizing things and dealing with the fact that they were also a lot of the times, very internally hierarchical. And I just wonder, to what extent does that offer a problem for degrowth? And to what extent does degrowth kind of depend on or gets caught up in a project of things that are not necessarily about surplus, but something like superadequation, the more kind of that which differentiates, that which adds superadequation.
Thank you. You want to?
Yeah, thank you. First, the capitalism and Anthropocene. And I understand that the Anthropocene can be, anthropocentric, Eurocentric, problematic concept. But the capitalism is kind of like reified vision of the world because it's not really capital that is really changing our planet. Capital doesn't exist without human activity. So I still think that the Anthropocene is a more adequate way of describing our situation. And also because it's more scientifically accepted terms, even though it was like rejected last year, but it's still many people use it. So capitalism creates rather some kind of a divide. So as long as we add that, Anthropocene, it's problematic. So we have to emphasize this in relation to capitalism, class divide, global north-south divide, and so on. I think we can totally use this concept. And I even think that some kind of anthropocentric view of sustainability is necessary, actually. So I'm actually criticizing in my book Latour and Dana Haraway and those more popular monist view of ecology and the future society, because I think by abandoning the human perspective, we can only talk about sustainable society only in an abstract way, right? So in a way that I still hold to this more traditional kind of stance, which creates some criticism against my work, but it's fine. And Adorno, yes, my problem with Adorno is basically like Jameson, he doesn't talk about the future society, right? And then maybe also the positive science, it's we can totally use positive science to kind of criticize our economy or Anthropocene situation. Anthropocene is also positive science. They go to lake and then dig and then they, measure things. And so it's quite positivist, but it's very important. So it's also very typical, we are not going to this Adorno seminar, but I think it's really science, I think, as also Marx did, can be a very inspiring way of criticizing capitalism based on, heterodox political economy. I understand about degrowth return, and this creates some kind of negative images, but I think it's a very Hegelian expression that he actually maintains in that part. He says higher form. It's not just simply returning to the older form. It's a negation of negation. We destroy these communes, but then capitalism will be negated again. So that's the famous expression also in Capital that Marx actually goes back in that letter. But it's a higher form. But this negation doesn't mean it's super eco-modernist version of the future. It's rather some kind of transcendence of countryside and the city, meaning that of transcendence of global north and south. And these are, I think, important projects that Marx, of course, doesn't provide a concrete vision, and then it's our task to provide that kind of vision. And that's the same thing about anthropology. His anthropology is basically outdated, right? You don't read Morgan or Maine in your anthropology class anymore. So, even if you read it, it's about how those people actually, especially like Maine, it's like racist about those Indian societies. And then, but Marx, interestingly, always in his notebook say like donkey or assholes. And he criticizes where Maine expresses some Eurocentric views, meaning that he, at least Marx tried to at least distantiate himself from those colonizer perspective. Even though, it doesn't mean that he was expert of anthropology, and then his knowledge was clearly limited. And Morgan, even more problematic, he didn't even do a field work, right? He basically read all those classical works and then reconstructed all those historical developments. So these are not really like anthropology that we can utilize, but interestingly, for me, so this is related to David Graeber again, but it's like he's saying that actually the Western modern ideas of freedom and equality and so on are coming from the encounter with the people in the colonized lands. It's the same. Marx also tried to learn new things. It was really the eye-opening experience for Marx to see the different way of organization in the Iroquois Federation based on the matriarchy and the equal possession of land and the more democratic participation and so on. I think this really created a new horizon of his vision of post-capitalism. We can still criticize its limitation, but then I think the direction itself is quite inspiring. And then that's something that we can simply read more contemporary anthropology and the theory, natural sciences, and then integrate. I think one point I wanted to say is basically his system is unfinished. That's why it's very flexible. He can integrate new ideas as long as these 3 volumes of Capital as a theoretical framework, reification, labor theory of value, and these things remain stable. I think his theory can actually absorb so many things in a very flexible manner.
Thank you, Kohei. All right, we're going to do one more series of 3, and then there are more series. I see your hand, but we're going to start over here.
Hi, I'm Adrian. I'm an undergraduate here. I had a question that also turned on the idea of a return, but I have more to say on this. Also in the critique of the Gotha program, there's this idea of an after, and even in Degrowth, we have like some implied notion of history in there. And I think that today, as your debate with the eco-modernist shows, the main imagination problem rift that we need to address is like how our conceptions of history and progress are still so ridden with an idea of like technology and growth. And to me, the political task here to make degrowth palatable to a broad audience lies with proposing a historical imagination that will kind of bridge this rift between how today we struggle to think of degrowth as a positive thing. I think that your reference to Hegel maybe the problem that it is for people to imagine degrowth as a positive thing a bit too easily, and even presenting it as some kind of transcendence, Aufhebung of capitalism. Maybe we need to, I was wondering what your thought on this task of historical imagination to make degrowth into something that is properly desirable and not even a taboo, because even in France, you can't say degrowth on a TV set without being screamed at. It's basically like it is really tough. So I was thinking, how do you conceive of the task of your book in generating those forms of political and historical imagination? And how do you think we can serve this task of bridging this gap between what is right now and what is in the future?
Thank you, Adrian. Okay, we're going to get another brilliant philosophy undergraduate, Isaiah.
Hello. Hi. My name is Isaiah. I just want to say I really appreciated your focus or your emphasis of anti-imperialism and a critique of like the imperial way of living. And you had also quoted Andreas Malm in your slideshow. And I was wondering if you had read his recent work, The Destruction of Palestine is the Destruction of the Earth, and how said destruction might be thought of through the lens of degrowth communism.
Thanks, Isaiah. We're going to get one more, Daniel Kessler, front.
Are you familiar with Murray Bookchin's Ecology of Freedom? And I wonder, his argument, which is really, he's an anarchist, but he's also very well versed in Marx's work. And he points out that the productivism that people read in Marx is highly ambivalent, that there's, he's in capital, the rosy dawn, the bloody dawn of capital. There is this imagery both of destruction of life and destruction of environment. But the problem I always have, and when I'm listening to you that I have, is how do you see the current social relations of production, which are highly violent and destructive, shapes our political life and our sense of political possibility, which goes back to the question of historical imagination. When people's imaginations are attached to the commodity form in all sorts of perverse ways, and social relations between people are violent, aggressive, alienated, how do you see the political work of taking people from where they are throughout the world in a world of combined and uneven production and distribution? And when it goes back to what you said about the commons, right? The commons, in some way, we all live in the commons, but we all experience ourselves through the violence of capital's hegemonic ideologies as being opposed to one another, in conflict with one another. And how do you, the idea of cooperatives, small, right? It's groups of people, but we all live in an interconnected world of ecological violence, social violence, political violence, network politics. How do you, given those sets of relationships, how do you see this transition? And what you're saying also sounds a little bit like council communism. I don't know if so just a bunch of thoughts, and you gave us all a great deal to think about, and I'm really appreciative of your effort.
Thanks, Daniel. Back to you, Kōhei.
Yeah, thank you. And so, historical imagination is really impoverished in our society, and especially after the collapse of Soviet. Even socialists don't talk about socialism anymore. They criticize neoliberalism, but they don't really openly advocate communism and so on. And this is, Mark Fisher's capitalist realism is really going on. And then décroissance, degrowth, is really also a very unpopular term. So for me, it was kind of, basically the situation is similar in Japan. So it was my political attempt to revive these wars and this tradition in the 21st century, because I think that it's very important to go back to Marx, because he's not providing simply the systematic analysis of capitalism, but because he also provides this historical imagination, a society without money, without market, without commodity, which is, of course, super, it's fair to say it's impossible to achieve, right? I think if we establish some kind of socialism, there will be market, there will be commodity, and there will be money. But I think it's still important to think that kind of ideas And in that sense, I really kind of managed in Japan to squeeze these vocabularies like degrowth into the mainstream discussion. And that was like a great success as a political project because it really opens up the new relationship to the current situation. Japan has been stagnating the economy for 3 decades and people get really upset. But once you kind of adapt this degrowth framework, of course, it's bad because it's capitalism, and if it doesn't grow, it's not degrowth, it's a recession and a stagnation. But at the same time, you pay more attention to other dimensions that are not reflected in GDP. And then Japan has good public education system, good public transportation, education, a lot of nature. I mean, these are the things that are not mainly discussed when people talk about how to reboost Japanese economic growth and so on. So really able to shift. And I hope that the similar thing will take place outside Japan too. And especially the younger generations are, I think, more open to this kind of idea. So I don't know. I mean, we still have to really concretize this vision of what degrowth really means, because degrowth is only the negation. So it creates misleading and inevitably. So maybe we have to come up with another term, right? So these are the things that I think, of course, Marx didn't provide an answer for this. So it's really a political task that we have to do based on his unfinished project. About anti-imperialism, I haven't read Andreas Malm's new pamphlet, but yes, basically the point is, as far as I understand, that it really is the same thing. Degrowth gives some perspective that actually growth is creating not abundance, it's creating scarcity, and also the production of capital and commodity is clearly tied to destruction, exploitation, oppression, and these are, basic insight. I mean, for this simple idea, you don't really have to read all the notebooks and the manuscript, but still, I think it's really important to always go back to Marx to understand this violence and destruction of capital accumulation, because we often forget. Department of Economics or the mainstream ideas about technologies, these are really hiding this dark aspect of capitalism, which basically the situation. So the reason why I still think the Marx is important is the situation hasn't really changed from the 19th century, many things. And then his question about actually Western societies are destroying instead of creating, they are only destroying the nature instead of, these questions that Marx tried to solve is something that's very similar that we also have to struggle today, right? So in that sense, he doesn't provide answer because his knowledge is very much limited in the 19th century. But the way he poses question and he tried to struggle is a very good way for us to also overcome some naive presupposition. I also used to naively advocate for Green New Deal. But then with Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, I also changed my views. And this is something that also Marx it was going through, and I just find some sympathy with it. And Bookchin, yes, I like reading his work, and then that's why my vision of late Marx, last Marx, is almost like anarchist communist, right? So maybe some people say, okay, Saito's communism is not really different from Bookchin, and it's not very interesting because it's the kind of repetition of 80s and so on. Well, maybe true. We just use the new notebooks and so on. But at the same time, I think the problem is anarchism. I think Marxism or socialist tradition provides, as I said, a consistent analysis of capitalism in a more theoretical as a framework. And then based on that, it also gives the vision of a bigger social transformation. But I have to admit that in this book, because of the limitation of historical imagination, due to the kind of the weakening of the left and the Marxism in the last 30 years, my examples have to be constrained on the level of small local commons and cooperatives that are not very revolutionary in that sense. It's not really about class struggle, and it's not about revolution and so on. So it's really the limitation of theory, but also that it's also coming from practice itself. So maybe that is something that changes. I might be able to overcome one day with this also the changing situation, right? So for me, it's very important to think or reread Marx with today's situation. So it's still a work in progress in that sense.
Thanks, Kohei. Okay, I've got three last questions. A question two? All right, well, Sergio.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Sergio Grossi from City University of New York. And I want to ask if in some extent Degrowth can be sometimes epistemological imperialist. Because I was thinking, for example, in Mujica, that trying some sort in Uruguay to implement some Degrowth. And they would say that the trade union was fighting strongly against him in the implementation because they want more money, more material things, and he was saying you need more free time and so on. You know? And then in this sense also, how Degrowth can work with the nation and people that was historically excluded by growth. And not like the case of Japan, that is still a rich country, but I think in other countries that are very, very under the poverty line. That is. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's so awesome to see you in the flesh. My name's Sarah, and I'm from UC Berkeley Sociology. And my main question is about whether you imagine degrowth as its own mechanism of resisting contemporary capitalism through cooperatives, or if you see it as a vision for a post-capitalist future after capitalism's inevitable collapse. And if you do see it as the former, as a mechanism of resistance, then this is sort of a repetition of earlier questions, but how specifically do you see it resisting contemporary forms of neoliberalism and US military hegemony? And what does this vision demand of current wage workers and intellectuals?
Okay, we're going to sneak in two more questions. So we're going to have 5 quick questions. Sorry.
My name is Winter. Mine actually goes quite similar to that in the idea that I've been looking at sort of the actions that the Chinese and the Russians did in order to, quote, defend their revolutions. And so I'm wondering, how does degrowth factor into a world in which if capitalism is desired to constantly crush any opposition that is active, is degrowth thus a post-capitalist idea in the way that she was talking about, or can it be integrated while one is trying to defend the revolution? Like the Soviet Union technically have degrowthed while the sort of entire world was against it.
We're going to sneak in 2 more. Did you have a quick question?
I'm Diana Wegge. I'll be starting a master's at Yale School of the Environment. But I'm trying to create an anthology that shows how the systems that have to be in place for a peaceful transition to sustainability. So I hope to possibly use your book within it. And I just wondered, do you think that with this chaos that Trump is throwing, do you think it's almost creating a place where we can really start to change what's happening right now? As you brought up Greta Thunberg before, she said everything has to change. And so I hate Trump, but maybe right now he's throwing us all into this chaos but maybe it will come back to be to bring us along to degrowth and what you're advocating.
And then one last question.
Thank you so much for the talk. I'm Will. I'm an undergraduate at Fordham. I had a question. So given that in your answer to the third question, you described Marx's anthropology as personal anthropological study as outdated or limited, and given degrowth's framing as a return to the original Marx, like even when you were talking about volume 2 and Engels' maybe creative editing of volume 2, how that's maybe not the greatest idea. I'm wondering if in your research at any point, have any thinkers, Marxist or otherwise, performed in your mind a useful or helpful analysis of these sort of archaic types in envisioning the higher form that you talk about? So I'm thinking like Jose Mariátegui, the Peruvian communist, referenced the Ayllu in his work. So I'm wondering if just at any point you've seen people maybe do a kind of, you've seen a resonance maybe in the work of other thinkers in trying to analyze non-Western or pre-capitalist societies in service of a vision of the future. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So first, degrowth is basically an idea coming from global north, because degrowth demand this correction of excessive growth and so on. So it's never an idea coming from global south. And the global south obviously requires more growth, building new infrastructures, and they have to enjoy more. But so basically, yeah, the answer is simple. The degrowth is a revolutionary project for the global north. And in that sense, it's a kind of Eurocentric idea. But at the same time, that doesn't mean there is no relevance or from the global south, because these famous ideas like Buen Vivir or whatever are really compatible with degrowth ideas. In Japan, like sufficiencies and these things are also some kind of common sense, and then that can maybe provide some basis, right? So it's it must be a dialogue. I mean, that's why I say it's a return is a very important word. Right? So it's really learning from the other, and then it's for the sake of creating something new. But degrowth communism, I would say, already exists today. So it's like David Graeber, communism, baseline communism, and I said communism, everyday communism. So it's not like everything in our society is capitalism. We still have spaces and practices where we don't count on money, we don't seek to maximize profitability, and we don't try to exploit others. Without these more mutual aid and help and care, capitalism also doesn't function. So the basis is always a baseline communism. The point is basically try to expand this. That's something that even today we can do, even though we don't have any revolutionary subject coming, right? Of course, the problem is then it's just a small scale thing. It's like just a very minor resistance against this gigantic power of imperialism, capitalism, and so on. And that might be simply too late to save the planet. So then in that case, the peaceful transition might no longer be possible because we are overshooting these planetary boundaries and so on. 5 years ago, it was, the situation was a little more optimistic, I would say. You agree, maybe? But it really changed. But I think it's not because of Trump. Trump is not creating new problems. He's just making the existing problem more explicit. So in that sense, we should be thankful that we don't have to, point out these are basically the problems that are always there in the American societies and so on. So it's also creating the chance. The tariff is creating the chance that maybe the South has the more capacity or chance, opportunity to create different kind of relationship with North, distantiating from the North, dependence, abandoning the continuous dependence and exploitation, and then creating more South-South alliance, maybe more local economy on the level of African continent or Latin American continent or East Asian spheres. And so these are maybe the chance, I agree, but it's too early to judge. I mean, it really depends on the new movements from the right, from the left, and then how degrowth actually plays the role. These are not something that philosophers can answer. It's more practical questions. Yeah, I mean, outdated. So Marx, yeah, I cannot come up with now. I'm a little tired, so I cannot come up with good examples. But my point is that after reading many notes, and then how Marx took ideas from Levy, Morgan, and like those people, you can actually imagine then how Marx would have read David Graeber or Marshall Salins, and these are maybe creating the basis for more imagination and a more productive dialogue. So I'm not trying to defend that all the Marx actually had correct answers in his notebooks, but these notebooks were not published, so I discovered all the truth. No, it's not the case. I'm emphasizing his project is unfinished, his project is incomplete, his knowledge is limited, but that doesn't mean that we should abandon him. Rather, we should have more continuous dialogue with his ideas from a critical perspective, and this mega edition provides some foundation for further development. And I think that's really important today, especially we are in the deep crisis of capitalism.
All right, that's terrific. I think that actually responding to those questions, I think, kind of provides a good closure to the conversation. Some concerns, of course, about changing times, and I think I've heard that in your thoughts, in part changing conditions since you wrote the book itself, and the need to kind of rethink some pieces of it in light of the more drastic environmental situation that we find ourselves in. So we're looking forward to the next book and the next set of work that you'll be doing. First, I want to give you a big round of thanks and applause. Thank you, Kōhei. Thank you so much for your book and for joining us here. I also want to thank Ricardo Lombera, who makes everything possible. And Sharon Benson in the back, who's going to give us an incredible AV. Thanks, Sharon. And I want to invite you to the next. So we'll be returning to the annex next week. And we'll have with us Eduardo Cadava, who's joining us from Princeton to talk about his book, Politically Red, which is a remarkable and gorgeous volume that I hope you all will take a look at. And then the following week, we'll have Marx 1213, also at the annex, with Bruno Bostiels, who's here this evening, and we'll be kind of returning a few years back to the Civil War in France from 1871, and we'll capture that period in relation with other readings, Voltairine de Clères's The Commune is Risen, and some other readings. So see you next Wednesday for Eduardo Cadava, and then the week after for Bruno Bostiels. Thank you so much for being here.
Find the question in the app. Find the question.